be starting back up here in another minute or so. So I'll just leave my line open. Twitch. There we go. Okay. Looks like we are ready to pick back up. Seems like from what I could gather, everyone did well with that exercise. It's a good little starting point. And as I mentioned, I'm sure you probably saw why it was I didn't ask you to do the Unit 2 demo. Because the Unit 2 demo was literally asking you to do the following. It said, let me make my screen a little bit bigger so it's easier to see. I'm all for hands-on work. I think for tools like this, the more we get to try our hands at it, the better we'll ultimately get. However, a lab that said, pull up this page, and then you're done. Seemed kind of silly when Lab Unit 3 Demo 1 starts with this page as well, us logging in, and then actually doing something. So I wasn't sure if that was clear at the end of the last lecture. I just wanted to make sure that you didn't think we were missing anything. I just didn't have you do the login as a separate lab since we were logging in as due course of the Unit 3 demo. Everyone did well. The one trap that a few folks fall into, and it happens every course, is when you're creating those users, you have to watch out that you make sure that we create one admin and one user. And it's fine if you didn't. I was as I was saying, if you mistakenly created DS user as an account that was an admin account, the only thing that would have changed is when we then go in to try to enable them for the project, they're already there. Not a big issue as long as you understand the concept. The other thing we did in the exercise, and probably perhaps the most important part of it, was the domain engine management. And the reason why I think that's so important is because that's one of those odd little twists that you learn about in here, and you take it out of the course back and go back to work with it with that knowledge, so that should the error ever occur, should the account assigned to it, for example, become invalid, what if there's a password reset and the DSADM account's password were to change on the server? It's entirely likely that a server admin wouldn't know to look for this as a problem, but we do. And that's why I'm so glad they have you try that and see it, and so important that we make note of it. Because it's one of those odd little issues that if you know about it, and you've seen it at least once, it should never catch you flat-footed again. But if you've never heard of it, it can be a very painful error. So just to show you, to make sure we're crystal clear, if I go into domain management, engine credentials, first, notice that Ed server is in a list of server engines. And that's because of what we discussed earlier. It's possible, entirely possible, that you could have multiple data stage engines. And so therefore we would see each engine listed separately here. If you have more than one data stage engine in your domain, the only rule is that you can only have one engine per machine. There is one subtle way to get around that. Linux allows you to build a type of partition that would allow me to have more than one data stage engine on the same box, but logically it does not make a lot of sense. The reason we have more than one engine, as I mentioned earlier, tends to be for distributed computing. So if you're going to create more than one data stage engine in your domain, it's typically because I want to distribute the work over more than one machine. So that said, in our case, we have a very traditional, very common setup, one data stage engine on one box. Therefore, I only see one engine listed. When I go into Ed server, I'm able to open the configuration. And it's here that we set the credentials. As John quite eloquently pointed out, this is exactly what we do in this tool and most tools of its ilk. We say we're going to set one account to control the processes so that we know they run, so that the server's happy and we're not giving out a bunch of very dangerous accounts, but yet we're able to track who did what through the infosphere side of the world. But just to show you what it looks like should something occur with this, should an error crop up, let me go ahead and break it. So I'm going to set the username here to Jason. This is an account that I created in Infosphere, but it is not an account that the server will recognize. So now that I've updated that, watch where it shows up. To data stage's credit, it's very good about checking that every chance it gets because the results can be so catastrophic. When I go to log into the data stage designer, watch what happens. Student, log in, and I get an error. The error says, username password incorrect. If credential mapping is used, check the credentials mapped that the username and password are correctly configured. Because what it's doing is when each user logs in, it goes out and says, does that user map to a valid server-side account? And so even though we were just using one default, it's still carrying out that process. When each one of us logged in, it's taking our account, going out to the Infosphere server and confirming that we have an account with the appropriate permissions on the engine. And since that's now broken, that's what we're seeing. If I may just take that one step further, we have a little bit of extra time and I did want to show this to you. If I go into open user credentials from within here, that's where you can do the one-to-one mapping. And they don't always make it easy to recognize. So we showed you in the lecture material that under engine credentials, you can go in and change the configuration. But if under engine credentials, you choose user credentials, that's not the same thing as going to user and groups users. So from within the engine credentials, if I say open user credentials, the only one currently mapped is ISAdmin. So what I'm going to do is take the user JSON and map that to DSADM. You know what? Let me try something subtly different here. Let's map JSON to student. The student account is a server account, and I believe it's one with the appropriate permissions to run processes based on that data stage engine installed. We could go check it. If this doesn't work, we could go check if I do this correctly. So first thing I have to do is select the account I want to tie the credentials to. So the way I do that is you go to Browse in the bottom right corner here. From Browse, I can see the list of current users. There is my JSON account. I'm going to select JSON. There's also a filter, so if you wanted to choose a group, you could do so. And now that JSON is on the list, I can provide the JSON account a map to the student account. At the moment, you may recall that the default is broken. And now JSON is being tied to a specific account of its own, student. So, with that being the case, if I open up the client and log in as the JSON account, I get in. If I fix it, and hold with me here because I am heading to, there is a point to all this. If I go back in and fix the engine credentials, the part that we don't really discuss in the lecture is that this account that I'm setting isn't necessarily the account for everyone. You see, the problem I know that I've noticed this whenever we talk about it in the lecture, the problem is that it comes off as though we're saying you have one of three options. But the reality is you can choose an amalgam of those three options, or at least two of the three options. Because here I am setting up a default credential for DSADM. But it says, defining the default credential below is for users that don't have their own mapping. And so I mentioned that creating a map for each individual account does not make a lot of sense. John brought up that great point about we don't want to give out that many access accounts. Also, just from a sheer volume standpoint, trying to manage that many accounts can be problematic. But setting up a case where you say general users run as DSADM, but if a project manager launches something, they show up as student, you can make a case for that. That there's a select group of users in data stage who I don't want to just show up as generic DSADM. I'd rather they show up as a specific process that is easier to track, that is a different account. And that I can get behind. I can agree with that. The logic behind that, I've used it on occasion. And that's why when I go into open user credentials and I do a browse, they have that whole idea of things like a filter. Maybe we go in here and say, I want to filter for users who are part of or who have certain part of their name or are in a certain group. So I may go in and look for everybody who's in a specific group. Maybe the four of us represent the data stage admins, and we're all going to run as one account. All of our other users will run as a different server-side account. So just something to keep in mind that can be done. And that's why when we look at this, it shows that JSON runs as student. ISAdmin is hard-coded for DSADM. That's another neat trick. You see what they're doing there? They're saying ISAdmin is the default administrative account. If everything else goes wrong, if you mismap your default, at least we know this one account can get through. And then we set the default for everybody else. So I just like when time permits to show that to you because it does help us understand that there are a few options there above and beyond just strictly saying it's all one or all the other. And if I were to now log in as student, because ironically, even though student is an account that would work on the server, it's not one that is specifically mapped, so student would use DSADM. Now it gets through. Okay. So we have our account set up. We also set up our environment variables as they requested. In configuring your project properties, they had you look at permissions, they had you look at the log settings. Also under parallel, I don't know if you noticed this, but in addition to specifying whether or not you want the OSH to be visible, you can change the default formatting for your date string, your time string, for your timestamp decimal separator. So by default, they will use the system setting, whatever the server is set to. However, if that causes you any issues, you can override that and set it to your own format, which again is another nice option just to stow away should you ever need it. The couple times I've had to make that change are typically for logs, where I need the logs to all be in the same format between, say, data stage and other tools. So it may not be it has come handy on occasion to be able to change the formatting that we're applying. But there's one other piece I wanted to point out here on the General tab. There's an option here for enable runtime column propagation for parallel jobs. And that is an extremely important option to understand and ensure that we set it to the correct value. Because what it does is when you build a data stage job, so we're going to build a job that reads data from a database. And the data coming out of the database is from a table that's made up of, let's say, 5 columns. Let me draw it over here where I've got a little more room. So this table is made up of 5 columns. Literally just called C1 through C5. Okay. So when we read this table in, the schema, or I should say the table definition that we load, is one that would describe those 5 columns, their data type, if they're varchar, their length, etc. We read that data in, and it's going to come from the database stage to a transformer, let's say. In the transformer stage, if we were designing a process to reformat column 3. So column 3 is some form of unique identifier for a product or some such, and we want to reformat it based on some new company standard. So we're taking the first few characters, transcoding others, etc. Inside of the transformer, when we build the process, we would be designing it to work on column 3. And then, of course, we're going to map column 3 across to the output. Now, where I'm heading with all this is that the way a data stage job works by default is that if we were just to map column 3 from input to output, because that's the one we're looking to edit in the transformer, what you would end up with in your result would be a table made up of just one column. You see, even though we're not doing any transformation, any work to the other four columns, if we don't explicitly map them from input to output, we would lose those other columns. And that's typically a good thing. If the intention of this job were to produce an updated version of column 3, there's no need for me to carry forward those other four columns. That's overhead we simply don't need. So it's designed to say, unless you explicitly ask me to carry forward a column, I'm going to discard it. But in looking at this job, you say, well, wait a minute. For this particular job, my intention was to carry all 5 columns to the end to just, however, create an updated copy, a transformed copy of column 3. And so in a case like that, we have an option called propagation. If we enable runtime column propagation, what you're saying is whether or not I map the columns across, all the columns that come in persist to the end. So there's an option that we call RCP, runtime column propagation, which when enabled says if a column is here at the beginning, as these 5 are, then they are available to you at the end as well, mapped or not. So now when we get to the end, if we have RCP turned on, we could produce an output table of C1, C2, C3, C4, and C5. So to do that, we have to tell the job, I want to use runtime column propagation. If you don't turn it on, and you're going to see this, this will play out very heavily throughout the next few days, that we are constantly going to be having to map every column from input to output. Because in our labs, we don't enable RCP. We're going to do it the old-fashioned way. We're going to move them across by hand to make sure we understand that we must account for those columns we wish to keep. If you had a job where you wanted to enable propagation, where you said, well, I know that in this job, I want the data to always persist, then the way that we build that starts here. We first would have to go into the administration console and check the box that says enable runtime column propagation for parallel jobs. Once you check that option, it then becomes a job-by-job decision. So if I check that option, and then this is usually what I would do, exactly as they have it configured here is typically how I would configure it in the field. I typically build my projects, then I'll go in and I'll say enable RCP for parallel jobs. What I'm doing is I'm giving the author of the job the choice as to whether or not they want to use it. What I don't do under any circumstances is check the box below it. If you notice, let me uncheck this for a moment. When I enable RCP for jobs, a second option crops up right here, which says enable runtime column propagation for new links. If I check that, I am effectively making RCP the default, which means people who don't know what runtime column propagation is are suddenly going to be getting that propagation enabled in their jobs. And that's a rather scary proposition. Because if we go back to our simple little example here, what if the primary table didn't have 5 columns, but rather had about 500? I know I'm going a little overboard, but just for argument's sake. And of those 500, we only wanted 5 for the output. We wanted to produce a table of the first 5 columns, and we're going to update the third column in the transformer. That's all well and good. However, all 500 columns are going to be carried from the database to the transformer, from the transformer to the target stage, And then in the target stage, if we built the table to say I'm only outputting the 5 columns I want, we'd still get the right data. But with RCP turned on by default, if we didn't know to turn it off, we would end up getting all that data in the data stage job. So the reason why I was saying under no circumstances would you make RCP the default is because then if people don't know any better, when they build a job, they're going to be carrying a lot of extra overhead with them in every single job. So for RCP, my recommendation and the documented best practice is to enable it, but to not make it the default. If people know about it and they know how to use it, they can apply it. If they don't, they're not going to have it coming in accidentally. So enable it, but do not enable it for new links. And the reason I point that out is because it doesn't read like they're saying that's the default. Enabling RCP for new links is making it a default, and it certainly doesn't sound like that's what you're saying in the verbiage. Okay, so where are we? We have discussed a little bit about the architecture. We have, we have looked at how we manage the credentials and the project settings. From there, we went in and set up some new accounts. We made sure our environment variables were correctly configured for what it is for what we want to do within our project. And now we're ready to start bringing in some of that metadata. And so the reason why I kept that diagram from earlier, let me just pull that back up, I knew I was forgetting something, is because what we're looking at doing is bringing in the necessary data to here that we're going to then apply to our jobs. So let's just sketch this out really quick. Let me just close that door so we don't get any background noise here. So we are right on the doorstep of building our first jobs. And the first jobs we build are going to be jobs that deal with sequential file-based data. So we have data living in a file, and it's a CSV file. Now, for argument's sake, let's say we wanted to load that data to a database. So we want to build a job that's going to take in that CSV file, maybe send it through a transformer for some cleanup, and then send it on to the target of a database. When you're designing a job like that, we could go into the first stage and manually type in the column names, their data type, or we could simply load up the metadata. We could load up a table definition, get it into our project, a definition that defines the columns and their data types, their nullability, etc., and then load that so that now this stage knows what columns it's looking for. We'd much rather do that, and then from here forward, we're carrying our table definition. For purposes of consistency, for reusability, and of course, it's a lot easier, a lot safer to have those column names available to me rather than typing them out manually again and again and again. So when we talk about importing metadata, what we're trying to do is bring in something like a table definition that we're then going to use to build our job. When dealing with something like a CSV file, what if this CSV file was made up of 3,000 records? The part that tends to confuse folks a little bit is when we go to import a table definition from that file, we're not touching the data. We're not importing 3,000 records. What we're doing is we're extrapolating from this file what the table may have looked like that produced this. So what I'm trying to say here is if I've got a CSV file with 3,000 records in it, and my goal is to build a job to read those 3,000 records into my database, the first thing I need to do is to pick from this file a table definition. And to do that, the system, and we're going to see how to do that momentarily here, to do that, the system is capable of going through the data in that CSV file and coming up with an extrapolation of what the table would have looked like. But just understand that when we import a table definition, so when we do an import of the metadata, what we're trying to do is come up with a table definition. We're not trying to bring in the records. The records will get consumed when the job itself runs. But at the first stage, we're simply trying to say, can I figure out using this file what the table it's going to produce would look like? And so once we have that table definition, I can load it into a stage who will be capable of ultimately reading those 3,000 records. It's when I execute this job that all those 3,000 records are actually going to get read into the job, processed, and stored in the target database. So there's two steps. Get me the metadata, build a job from the metadata, and then execute the job to work with the actual records themselves. And I'll reiterate that when we see it in the lecture. I just wanted to try to set that from the beginning because that tends to be the part that confuses folks the most. What is it that we're actually importing when we connect to a data source and we say I need to import metadata? So let's take a look at how that works and a few other options for import export, and then we're going to try that out. When it comes to working with metadata, so we're going to first and foremost log in data stage because now we're working in the designer. My goal is ultimately to build a job. I need to be in the designer to do that. Then we're going to start working our way around inside of the data stage file structure. We're going to import a few table definitions and then ultimately use those table definitions to build jobs. When you log into the data stage designer, it's similar to logging into the data stage administrative client. We have to give it the server address for WebSphere, and we have to give it the server address for the engine. The only difference is that if you notice under engine, we also tell it which subdirectory, meaning which project. Earlier I mentioned that where your data stage engine is installed, you have a subdirectory where the projects reside, and that's what you're seeing here. We're asking to use edserver 9443 as the WebSphere layer, and for the engine, it's edserver underneath which there is a DS project directory, and it's the DS project directory that is the specific project we're connecting to. That project list, by the way, that's dynamic. Excuse me, that gets dynamically built based upon us typing in our credentials. It actually takes your credentials and uses those to populate that list so that we can see which projects I should even be allowed to attempt accessing. Upon login, here's the designer. We have the repository, as we talked about earlier. We have menus, toolbars, the canvas, the palette, and the logs. Remember that you don't have to keep the logs up, and you very well may want to give that real estate back. In fact, if you look at this example, let me annotate this for a moment because there is something very specific that's occurring here. Excuse me. In this example, what we have is a case where when they opened up their palette, it's probably going to seem to the person who's using it like the palette is broken. And it's not. It's just that there's not enough room for the palette to display its list. Because if you look at this little opening right here, that slightly different color background, that is the general tab in the palette being opened. So someone has come in here, they've clicked on general, they're opening the general palette tab, but there's not enough room for the general palette tab to display its options. The first time this happened to me, I was about 30 seconds away from uninstalling my client, sure that something had gone wrong with the client install, that it was a bad install, before I realized that it was actually just an issue dealing with space. The palette in this example simply does not have enough room to open up wide enough for me to actually see the objects inside of it. Which is why I was saying that you may very well want to get rid of the logs unless you're actually using them. So if you don't need the logs, if we were to get rid of this section right here, all of a sudden we'd have enough room so that that palette would be visible. So just keep that in mind. It'll happen periodically. When you go to open up your palette and you don't see any options popping up, it's typically because the palette is over constrained. There is not enough room for it to display the options inside of its menu. To remedy that, you need to get it more space, either by getting rid of something like the logs, or you can also expand it. It's a relatively new option. They added this maximize button right here. And so if I really wanted to keep my logs open, if I click maximize, what it will do is the palette will take up all of the space. It'll go all the way up to the top of this window. It'll block out repository. But again, then I'll have enough room to see those options inside of this window. So just keep that in mind. If ever it occurs that you're trying to view something inside the palette and you simply can't see what's inside of there, it's most likely an issue with the spatial layout of the palette. You very well may need to give the palette more room to work with. Okay. We talked about the repository window. I won't go through that in too much more detail again. We have standard folders and we have the custom folder. The only custom folder in this case is _training. We didn't mention earlier the quick find menu. That's a good option to take note of. Where it says open quick find, that's a good way to search for items, so that if you couldn't find a particular stage or an asset that you were looking for, open quick find allows me to do a search for that. And you can choose what type of asset. You can type in a full or partial name, and then it will run the search and come back with your results. Getting down to what it is we want to talk about in this section, though, import and export. With both import and export, we have the ability to bring resources into or out of data stage using a specific tool designed for data stage import export. So yes, we can go ahead and import things like a table definition from a sequential file or a table definition from a database, but we can also simply say I want to export assets from inside of data stage for the purposes of backing up or version control or migration. And we do that through the data stage import-export utility. That's what they're referring to here. Let's say you have a project. We discussed this option earlier. You have a project and it's ready to go from dev to production. Your jobs are ready, all your resources are in place. So what do? We say export data stage component, and then it gives you two options. You can use the DSX or XML format. You specify a path, this time on the client system. This is one of the few options that wants a client-side path. And then we can complete the export. When it comes to the option of DSX versus XML, I would typically recommend using DSX. I really haven't been able to come up with too many advantages for XML. And I'm someone who uses XML quite often. I'm a fan, if you will, of XML. However, in this particular case, I really have a tough time finding a benefit to using XML because DSX is text-based as well. Usually the advantage of XML is my ability to put complex data into a human legible format. In this case, DSX does the same thing. So the only real advantage you could come up with for XML is if you were going to build a custom application or a style sheet or something of that sort to format it, you could do that. But otherwise, there really isn't any great advantage to using XML.
Is DSX rigid format?
Sorry, what was is DSX?
Is it like rigid file format versus XML by its very definition is completely extensible. So even if you change the object model, the document object model, right? That as long as the system can ignore tags that are no longer relevant. Do you know what I mean? So I can load XML in that has tags that have been deprecated, and as long as it has essential tags, it'll still pull data.
Yeah, data stage that's true in theory, but I mean, by that, as far as data stage is taking advantage of the extensibility of XML, it doesn't. If I were to try to load an XML file with illegal tags, in other words, anything that gets exported can't be edited and has to stay in the format that it was dictated by the original export. That said, they're both equally flexible. Because if I have a DSX export from, say, version 8.5 and I wanted to bring it into 11, I can. And as you said, it's going to apply the same logic. I just get worried about and I know what you mean about the extensibility of XML. I just get worried about, it's not a bad idea. I've never thought of it from that standpoint. If using the XML, am I padding myself for potential future versions that they have of objects that they haven't considered yet? There could be something to that because the DSX structure is all based on, it's also hierarchical. It's also based on objects and then their attributes with name value pairs underneath it. It almost looks like, if you've ever compared XML to JSON data, it almost looks like that. It's the same concept of still hierarchical, still based on where you live within the document, but instead of having tags around it, it's just name value pairs. But that's a good point, John. I've never thought of it from that perspective, that though it hasn't happened yet, could it potentially occur where an XML export from version 11, years from now, may be adaptable, whereas a DSX may not? Yeah, that's a good point. If you're looking for long-term data storage, there may be something to that. That's the best argument I've heard yet for using XML instead of DSX. It hasn't been the case as of yet, but that could be a reason why you'd use XML going forward. So if everybody, I know I'm kind of going back and forth, it's just because it's a very interesting concept John brings up, and one that an argument that I haven't yet ever heard for using XML. The extensibility of it going forward could mean that it's more durable, whereas DSX could someday become an issue.
If you haven't run into it on this many versions, though, I mean, you're probably right. The DSX, I would imagine IBM would maintain compatibility, right?
Yeah, they're pretty big on using DSX. Is whenever you go and look at one of their knowledge center documents about forward migration, it always starts with do a DSX export, and then so that's always been the model that we followed. The biggest argument I've heard in favor of XML has been if someone were to write a simple style sheet that could parse through your XML and give you a list of objects therein, then you can make a really good case for it. And that might sound like, well, yeah, that's interesting, but why would we do it? However, if you said every night we create a backup this way, and some folks do, creating an XML backup, I can end up with perceivably thousands of XML files representing different points in the project. being able to write a custom application that can go through them and just create a quick, concise list of what's in there with maybe the short description field. I could see some benefits there. But other than that, mostly it's DSX at this point. So here's what it looks like. When I go to do my export, we can simply say export everything from within a project, but you can also do it selectively. And we're going to see later on throughout the course, you could actually use the results of a search as the input of your export. So you could say, do a search for everything edited by Jason in the last week. Take the result set, and that's what I want to export. It does allow me to be quite specific. Here we're doing an export of resources in the project. We designate if we want to use DSX or XML. There's just a drop-down option as to which choice, which type we want. Where it says export to file, this is one of the very few times it wants a file on the client side. We talked a little bit about this earlier, that the file paths are server-side by nature, except for exporting. Export and import are referring to client-side paths. So we choose where on the client we want to create this DSX export or XML export, depending on which format we choose. The result is a single flat file that has all of the necessary data in there. On the reverse side, to do an import, it's import data stage component or import data stage component XML, depending on which format we used. When they talk about doing the import, they show you the screenshots that look like this. We select a file, DSX, import all, and that's the end of it. However, it's important to understand that you don't have to import everything. Where they show the import all, if you were to choose import selected, just go back for a moment, it looks fairly similar, the list at least looks fairly similar to what you see here. And the reason I point that out is because there have been cases where I've been brought in to do mentoring. So I'm not coming in as a consultant, I'm not necessarily just there as a trainer. It's sort of training plus looking at specific examples where we're trying to get them ready to take over so that when I leave, they have the knowledge and some experience with their project-specific goals. So in those cases, what we'll do in some occasions is we'll create a series of jobs that are what I like to call archetypes. We create these archetype jobs that aren't exactly what you need to fix a particular problem. They give you the boilerplate that you're going to use. A job for transformation of old IDs to new IDs. A job for performing a lookup based on sparse lookup details from a database, things like that. A job designed to pull data from a relational database structure and write it to an XML file. So we build a couple of these archetypal jobs, and then what we'll come up with is a project that houses them. And so I've got this project filled with jobs that aren't exactly what you'd use in production, but that you're probably going to import at some point to use as the basis for the jobs you're going to build. So what we'll do is we'll build those jobs. We put rich descriptions with them to try to make sure people understand what each job is designed for. And then we build a project that houses them and export it into a DSX. So what you're left with is you've got an install of data stage, you've got somewhere out in your file share a DSX file, inside of which you have a whole series of data stage jobs that you can import. And so when you're getting ready to start a project where you need a job that's going to create XML data, for example, instead of starting from scratch, you'll go out to that project on the file share, and you'll say, I want to import from that DSX, but you don't want everything. You want to do an import selected. And you're going to select the 2 or 3 jobs that are built to deal with XML creation, and then use those as your starting point. So it's often proved beneficial, in my experience, to have a DSX out there with a collection of assets that people can use as a basis going forward. And in that collection, you're certainly not going to want to do an import all. You're going to want to say import selected, see the list, pick the ones you want, and bring them in. So I just wanted to point that out, that they demonstrated in the screenshot simply using an import with import all. But import selected in the real world can be a very useful trick, especially if that DSX represents a library of assets and you're picking which ones you want from the library. So that in and of itself tells you one of the big use cases for this whole export-import, the ability to create resources to be shared among other team members. Of course, another reason for this is for backups. We can create a DSX or XML backup and then add that to a source control system like CVS. You can build a CVS repository, and then what people will do is they'll create that DSX in their CVS workspace and then check the DSX file in, so that the DSX becomes your weekly, nightly, whatever the project policy is, backup, and version controlled backup at that. In fact, that became such a common process, as I was mentioning earlier, we now commonly use this whole idea of export-import for moving data from development to production. And they've actually built a tool called the InfoSphere Server Manager, which is specifically designed to allow you to do the export-import. So they've actually built a tool so that you don't have, the idea behind it was they didn't want us to have to go into the data stage designer, connect to our development project, export to a local file, then log into designer on the production system, grab that DSX and manually bring it in. So they built a tool to sort of manage that. It's a tool that allows me to connect to two different domains and say I want to export from this project in this domain, import from that project in the other domain, so that you can do it all from one GUI. So the whole idea of export-import's really taken on a life of its own as a tool for all sorts of things. Sharing, archiving, and now even for migrating to production. Oh, one quick point, if I may. I knew I forgot something. When you import, where was it? Somewhere in here they mentioned environment variables. We've only seen environment variables thus far as those variables that control what the system does. Where's the config file at runtime? Do I want to log certain details like the OSH, like the score, like the process IDs? However, you can create your own environment variables. And one of the most common set, database username and password. You create environment variables for the DB user and password so that when we go from dev to prod, I don't have to touch anything in the program, it just picks up the new values. And in fact, there's a user-defined environment variable type of password, which means, again, since I made John the DBA before, I'll stick with it. John's a DBA, he sets up the environment variable on production and goes in and types in the password. I'm going to call on that environment variable, but that doesn't mean I can see its value. So it can actually create a protected password that my job is going to use without having to give me the password. So it's a very neat system and very heavily used at that. Having said that, if I create a job in development that uses two custom environment variables, then we call ours database user, database pass. I design a job based on those two variables. The job goes from dev to production for the first time. At import, it's smart enough to recognize that there were two environment variables in the job we just imported that don't yet exist in the production server. So what does it do? It's going to create those two variables. The only thing you have to remember, and it's what they're pointing out here, is that they'll start out as empty. Because it says, I don't know what the value is supposed to be on the new server, I just know you need them to exist or the job won't compile. So it will create the variables, but we're still responsible for providing them a value. Okay. So that's dealing with data that already exists in data stage. We're talking in those export and import scenarios about a case where you have a project that has data within it and you want to export those assets to another system, to another project, to a backup, what have you. How do we get metadata into data stage in the first place? And that's the one place in the whole course where I feel like we sort of went off the rails a little bit. Because up until now, they had such a nice logical flow going. We had a new project. We set the environment variables. We set the user credentials. We were getting ready to open up the project. And then we start talking about what happens when you have a project with a bunch of data already in it. Well, where did the data come from? Because by our reckoning, we've yet to build anything inside of our project. And as I said earlier, the very first step in doing that, in building something in your project, is to get metadata into that project so I know what my source and or my target are supposed to look like. To get that metadata into your project, we have to somehow import it. And what they're mentioning here is that there are numerous options. There are many options for importing metadata. We can import from a sequential file, from a relational database table, from COBOL copybook files, and quite a few others. In fact, you can better get a feel for it here when you actually see the screenshot that exists from when we go to import table definitions. Under that table definitions is a list of options of types of import that we can do. We're going to start with sequential files, and we're going to work with sequential files quite a bit in the rest of this class, which is a good thing. Their focus of the class was to teach you how to design data stage jobs, not to worry about the specifics of connection for a particular vendor database, because obviously then all of our connections would be based on DB2 in our examples. So rather than worrying specifically at this point about connection types, we're having you focus on job design. So most of the data we work with will come from sequential files. Eventually we'll come around to using some ODBC and DB2 connections just to get a feel for how that piece works. But most of our jobs for the majority of the class will be based off of sequential based data. So if that's the case, how do we get data out of there? Sure.
Based on, correct me if I'm wrong, after the initial, like, hey, I'm going to grab this data from a file, from that point forward, regardless of the source, they're just columns in a stream, right?
Exactly
So
right.
the steps through, like, whether my inbound is from a database or from a file or from what do you call it, like a REST API or whatever else it can handle, then my staging and destination essentially don't change. Their
Correct.
source is irrelevant, right? Wow,
That's exactly right. That's why they designed it the way they did. Because so just so everyone caught what John was saying, because it's important for understanding why we do things the way we do in here. It really, other than a few variables in the first stage, it really doesn't matter where my data comes from, because the minute it comes out of that source stage, it's data in data stage. Whether it came from a database, a text file, an XML file, a REST API, once it leaves that first link, it's data stage data from there on out. And that's what we want you to focus on, is managing the data stage data. The beauty of the sequential files is that if you have any questions or concerns, or you're not sure if what you're doing is right, we can open up the data and actually look at it in a simple format. So it helps us in learning it. But John's right. Once it hits this point, really, doesn't matter where it came from anymore. So it's really a relatively small part of the puzzle, which is why, as I was saying, we use sequential data because it's a good format to learn with. And eventually, once we've kind of maxed that out, we'll try some other connections to make sure that you do get to see those stages in action. But as John points out, we're really worried about what's happening between here and here, because it's all the work we do in between that we have to learn how to manage. That's the real value add of the ETL job. It's a fantastic point. So one thing that you may have to do in the real world is pull data from a sequential file so that you're able to consume it. And that's what I was referring to here. We've got this CSV file. Before I can get it into my job, I need to make sure I can explain how to read it. And in fact, it's harder to work with a sequential file than a database, because in a database, I would just say, read the table and then bring the table in. But with a sequential file, there's a lot of variables that could be at play. What was the delimiter? Are they using double quotes or single quotes? How are they defining null values? Was it written on Linux or Windows? So there's actually a lot more to do if you're trying to use a sequential file as your source than if we were using some other more data-centric source. So here's how we actually can bring in a table definition from a sequential file. This is the import menu, import table definitions. And as I said, there's quite a few options there. COBOL copybook, there's an option, we mentioned APIs, there's an option there for WSDL, web service description language files. XML schemas is an option. And of course, among there, we have the option for sequential file. So we're going to start with sequential files. Import a table definition from a sequential file. And it opens up an editor that DataStage has designed for this purpose. What you have to do in that editor is specify the directory that you want to import from. I'll demonstrate this live for you because it always gets folks the first time through, particularly that directory step. It's a browser that only shows you directories, and we're so used to clicking until we get to the final asset that you want, it throws people off, that it's only showing you parent directories. So we have to, in directory, choose the parent directory I want to look in, and then it gives me fields to help whittle it down. It says what type of file and what character names, or what name contains. It does a fuzzy search on name. In case you had a directory with 10,000 files in it, and you want to look for one called purchase orders, you could specify a .txt file with purchase orders in the name. So we do have some search criteria in there that we can apply to the directory. Once you find the file that has the data you want, in this case it's warehouse.txt, we specify where we want to create the metadata. In my project, under training metadata, that's where I'm going to put my table definition. Now here's the point I was trying to make earlier about the 3,000 rows versus what we're actually importing. Warehouse.txt has 3,000 records in it. We're pointing to that file and we click the import button. What it does is it opens this up. Now what this is it is the formatting for the import of a text-based table. And the preview it's showing you down there helps us understand that it's not actually going to go through every record in the file, because that would become an ETL job in and of itself. It's looking at a sample set. Memory serves, the max sample set it'll go through is 9,999. It won't go above that, because it says above that and you've just built a whole nother ETL job. What if you had a full database migration with 5 billion records in it? So it takes a sample set of the data, and based on that sample set, it's going to try to come up with data types. Usually they're pretty good. It might require a little bit of tweaking from us, but typically they're pretty close in my experience. So I gave it that warehouse file with 3,000 records. What it comes up with is it's showing me based on a pipestem delimiter. Originally, this would have opened up with comma delimited double quotes, and in the preview, it probably would have looked like a mess. I know that warehouse is delimited using a pipestem, so I had to change the delimiter. Right here, we specify it's actually using a pipestem with double quotes for the string. And then when you click preview, all of a sudden the data looks like what we see here. So we say, okay, pipestem was the right choice. This looks a lot better. The other thing that you have to make sure you get right is whether or not the first line are column names. Looking at the preview, I can see right away that the first row has column names. And the reason why it's so important to get that right is if I don't check the box, first line is column names, what I'll end up with are columns called field 1, field 2, field 3, field 4, field 5, and field 6. And so if you make a mistake in your labs and you ever forget to check that box, your column names will be way off. I could live with that. You could actually work around that. The bigger problem is the data type. Because if I have a column that's carrying a number, an integer, a date, but I don't tell it that the first line are column names, if one record is a varchar, they all have to be capable of being varchar. So you forget to check that box, and your data types are very likely going to come in out of line. One of the best things, in my opinion, that they did with this tool is they made it so that you cannot complete the import from the format page. The page that's on the screen right now, where I say first line column names, pipestem delimiter, and double quotes, notice the OK button is grayed out. It will not let me finish from this page. I have to go to the define page first, which is a fantastic design. Because what it means is, if I made any mistakes, I can't import the table definition without at least seeing the ramifications of that. When you go to the define tab, it's going to show you the column names, the data type. So it's here that you'd be able to catch it very quickly if you go there and you see, wait, my column names are field 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and they're all varchar. that doesn't seem right. That's how you know I made a mistake. You go back a page, you check the box that says first line column names and define it again, and now we see that it looks correct. So this is a great fail-safe that they put in for us. This is what we're importing. The column names, the data type, it will import the format, but we're not bringing in the actual rows. We're not bringing in the records. We're bringing in the table definition that we figured out from the records. There's even a set of extended properties that if we wanted to see them, we would have to click on the number to the left of the column name. I've always felt that DataStage was pretty well done. For a tool as complex as it is, they're pretty good about making things fairly intuitive, or as intuitive as is reasonable. But on this one, I just don't know what they were thinking. Quite honestly, I don't know where this idea came from, but it's the number to the left of the column name that you double click on to open up the extended properties. I don't know why we couldn't at least put an underline there so it looked like a link in a web page, or maybe even color coded or something. If I didn't show you where this was, I don't know how you'd ever be expected to find it. So that's my little bit of belly aching late in the day. I just don't know where this design point came from. Having said that, if you double click on the number 1, this is what you get. This is the extended properties of the warehouse column. And so if you look, it says things like it's a SQL type of integer. We have the length, nullability. So these are little other odds and ends that are really ETL centric. So you'll see places as we get into more advanced jobs where we do have to start editing these. But the main tab here is really showing you a table. This is just a straightforward table. However, there are some things in an ETL job that we have to do that are special. For example, in ETL, we would have to know, in reading this from a text file, to translate it to a database, what does a null value look like? And so in the extended properties, I have a way of saying, if it's nullable, it's 4 X's in a row, that mean it's a null column. Those are what I mean by extended properties that are really ETL centric. And we're going to see that. We're going to see nullability. We'll see padding characters. We'll see examples where we need those extended properties. But by and large, the things that exist in the extended properties panel deal with ETL specifically. Whereas what you're seeing in the main panel, those are dealing with the data just simply put as a table. Here's what the import results in. The last thing I'll say about the import is that while we don't import the records themselves, DataStage does try to import as much other information as it can. Meaning, technically the goal of the import here is to create a table definition that could have just as easily come from a database as it could have from a text file, as it could have from an API doc. So what we're seeing here on the columns would look the same no matter what the source was. But because I imported from a sequential file, I had to tell it the delimiter, the row indicator, how strings were surrounded. And so because of that, if I go to the format, it did record that. They don't show it, but on that format tab, it records that information with the intent that if you ever had to read a text file, if you ever actually had to read warehouse.txt, it's going to record the other details that would help you do that. So it creates a table definition, but it also does store any other odds and ends, like what was the formatting, double quote, single quote. Was it pipestem? Was it comma delimited? Was it ODBC or DB2? So it stores whatever details we give it for the reading of the data, so that should we need them later on, we can reuse them rather than having to enter them again. And we're going to see that play out quite a bit. We're going to see these table definitions that we import get used for their columns, and then sometimes we use them for their formatting because it's stored as part of that record. So where does that leave us? We have 2 demos to work on. They're short. They're relatively short. And if you'd be so kind, I'd like to walk you through a few steps in one of the 2 demos, because I think it'll help you, and I think it shows you a few interesting little caveats here. So we're looking at Unit 4, demo 1. If you'd be so kind as to go ahead, open up your lab machines. I'll do the same here. I'll give you a second to get those open, because I want to walk you through just one or two odds and ends, and then I'll get out of your way. But I think this will save you a little bit of time and also show off one or two quick tricks they didn't mention in the lecture. Once you open up your lab machine, make sure you have the Data Stage Designer open. So if you don't already have it open, you can open the designer with account student, username student, password student. If you already have it open with a different account, that's fine. I was just saying an easy one to use is the student account. When you first log into the designer, it pops up with the new menu. We're not creating a job yet, so you can just cancel out of that. So does everyone have their designer open? John, good, okay. Nithya, do you have your designer open? Did we lose Nithya?
I'm sorry. No, I'm trying to log in. I tried to log in, but it's going into InfoSphere information server, so I'm not sure how to go back to the environment.
Cool. So from your desktop, you want to...
Okay, found it. Yeah, I opened the designer.
Okay, excellent. So what I wanted to walk you through is demonstration 1 in unit 4. Asks us to log into the designer, and then it asks you to create some folders. But what I wanted to show you is that if we just change the order of the steps just a little bit, instead of creating the folders first, let's do an import first. Go ahead and do, we're going to select import menu. From the import menu, I'd like you to select data stage components. Go ahead and follow along here, please. So we're saying import it from within the designer, import menu, data stage components. It comes up with import from file. We don't want the file that it's got in there by default. Just a quick note, that file has all of the lab solutions for the entire class. It's good to take note of, because I'm going to send you a copy of it so that you have a copy of all the jobs we worked on. Also, should you run into any serious trouble with any one lab and you need the result of that lab for the next one, you could always import a single job here or there throughout the course if you needed it. But for now, we don't want to put all the lab solutions in there to start with. Select the 3 dots, the ellipses at the end of that line, and you can browse. And in the list of files, there should be one called tabledefs.dsx. That's the one you want to select. So we select tabledefs.dsx, click open. We can leave import selected just to see what's going to happen. So go ahead and click OK. And it should show that there is one table inside of that DSX file, which does not yet exist in our project. Select that table, and then go ahead and click OK, and that will import it. What I wanted you to see is that in demo 1 of unit 4, they ask us to create folders _training, and then underneath that, jobs and metadata. Well, if you look at your repository window now, you already have _training metadata. DSX files, remember their relative path to the project root. It's because of the fact that there may be multiple files that have relationships to each other. So for referential integrity, it has to remember their paths. Hence the import built for us _training metadata. So the only folder we have to create is if you right click on _training and then just say new folder, they want us to create a folder called jobs with a capital J, J-O-B-S. So not only did that save us a couple of steps, I just thought it was a great way to illustrate that it really does bring in its full path relative to the root of the project, which we didn't mention in the notes. So it's just nice to see that in action. If you finish that, where that leaves you in the lab book, and I'll get out of you right here in a moment, is it leaves you on, they ask us to take a look at it. I'll pull it, if you want, I can just put it up on my screen. The result of the import is the employees table, a table that has 3 columns, emp ID, name, and hire date. And so we're going to use that in a job we'll design tomorrow. There's a task 4 in demo 1, which is to export. And then after you complete the export step, you're on to demo 2. Allow me to just do a quick demonstration here, and then I'll get out of your way for the remainder. I do want to show you, just so you've seen it in action once, the importing of a table definition from a sequential file. So for this one, if you'll be so kind, just watch my screen for a few minutes and let me know if you have any questions. The still shots in the book just don't do it justice. When I import a table definition from a sequential file, so import table definitions, and then I go to sequential file. To import, what part I was saying that throws most folks is the first piece, the directory. The file I want lives in a folder called DSESS files. So when I click browse, notice it says look in DSESS files. That's what I want. So I would click OK. What throws folks off is they don't see the files in there and they think that that means it's wrong. This browser only shows you directories because it's looking for just a parent folder. The parent folder is selected. Then I see I can choose text files, all files, or just CSV files. Depending on what the suffix is, I can narrow down the list. And the file you're going to import in your lab is selling group mapping. So when I select selling group mapping, make sure you give it a target folder. I want to put it under training metadata. And then I click import. This file is comma delimited, and you can see that it looks nice and neat. If I wasn't sure, I could try pipestem or something else. So let me put a pipestem in here. Watch what happens when I preview it. I can tell right away something doesn't look right. So it's comma delimited. When I preview, all of a sudden it looks a lot better. As I was saying, if you forget to tell it that the first line are column names, when I go to the define, comes up field 1, 2, 3, 4, and they're all varchar. That's why you have to look at the definition first. I realize I made a mistake. I go back to format, first line column names. And now if I look at the definition, good column names, better data types, I'm ready to import. I click OK. And it comes back to this menu. The reason being that in the field, we may need to import more than one file from the same place or more than one table definition from the same place. So it keeps you on that page in case you wanted to choose other options. If I go to look at what I just received, selling group mapping, here's what I meant by it will save everything it can. The columns, you really couldn't even tell the difference if those columns came from a database, an API, a text file. But if I look at the format, it recorded, comma, double quotes, first line column names. Because I may need that down the road if I'm building a job to read this from the text file. So I'm able to reuse that information. Also, one other quick note, and then I'll get out of your way for good here. Let me do one more import. Table definition, sequential file. I'm going to grab that warehouse file they showed in the lecture notes. Import. Notice this one. They did this on purpose to keep us on our toes. They did not just make it easy with every file using comma and double quotes. They keep us on our toes. As we import metadata throughout the course, sometimes we're going to have to use double quotes, single quote, pipestem. So this does not look right. How do I adjust it? If it's a tab, a white space, or comma, I can choose the radio button. If it's anything else, I go over here and type it in. Here I'm going to type in pipe stem. Try it with pipe stem and double quotes. What does the preview look like? A lot better. First line column names. And now if I go to preview and define, I don't have to preview. That's just a habit. Define is what's really going to show you the end result of what you'll get. Now, when I started this one off, I did not change the target directory. And that's part of what I wanted to show you, because in the real world, I constantly forget to set my target. In fact, I don't even bother anymore. I don't create metadata folders. I just use the default because it's just easier than waiting for me to forget and having to fix it. The default directory for a table definition, so I never specified training metadata, hence it used the default location. Let me get rid of my logs so I have a little more room here. The default location is under table definitions, and then it depends on where I got the definition from. Sequential, DSESS files, there's my warehouse. I can use it in either location. So there's nothing wrong with it, but if you ever did make the same mistake I just did in the labs, and you wanted to keep it by the book, all you have to do, you can drag and drop to recover that. So I can grab it from here and just drag it up to metadata and put it under metadata. So in case it ever happens to you and you want to put it in the right place, it's just a drag and drop. Okay, so here's what you're doing. You're doing Unit 4, Demo 1, Task 4, because we did the rest of that one together. And then you're doing Demo 2. When you're done with those, you're free to go. Just please check in with me so I know who's done and when. Excuse me. That way I can kind of keep track. I'll put myself on mute. Honestly, these two should probably take you all of about 10 minutes. That second demo is just, it's exactly, you saw me do it. It's not that bad. If you need any help, just give me a shout. And when you're finished, you're free to go. We'll kick off again tomorrow at 9 a.m. Central, 10 a.m. Eastern. I'll be online at least 20 minutes before. So if anyone needs any help tomorrow morning or any questions, what have you, you can catch me then. All right. Thanks, everyone.